Welcome to the second video in the Excel pivot tables learning path. Previously, we've seen some examples on how effective and easy it is to work with pivot tables. In this video, we will discuss the very first steps you need to take in order to create a pivot table. If you're viewing this video through YouTube, you can access the sample data in the link below. Also, you will find the results of the steps we're going to discuss in a separate link. But if you're part of the Excel Pivot Tables Learning Path curriculum, you will find the sample data in the course resources. In this video, we will discuss what kind of data structure is required for a pivot table. We will see how to add one, and we will look at the basics, such as adding different row and column labels and working with value field settings. So let's start. For any pivot table, you need data in a tabular structure. That means that your data has to be arranged in columns and rows. That's a basic requirement. In the first row of your data set, you will have the labels, which will be your points for different levels of aggregation. And then in the rows below, you see a separate row for each single data entry. What is important that within your data set, you don't have any breaks. So you cannot have, for example, you cannot have an empty column in your data, as in such a case, pivot tables will only look at this range. Let me undo this. Similarly, if you have an empty row, then the pivot table will only pick up data until this point. So bottom line is you cannot have empty columns or empty rows inside your data. You cannot have also merged cells. If this is merged, it will not pick up, the pivot table will not pick up those figures. So your data has to be in a tabular format, arranged nicely into individual cells, broken down to different columns. When adding a pivot table, you need to select a range, or not select it, just click on a single cell. If you're clicking on a single cell, the pivot table will recognize all the data which is in a consecutive format, so which is linking to each other in consecutive columns and rows. If you are selecting something, the pivot table will only look at this range. So my best advice is always to just click on any single cell in your data set. This way, pivot table will automatically pick up all your data. So to add a pivot table, you need to click on the Insert tab up here in the ribbon part of Excel, Insert tab. The first option you will see is a pivot table button. So just clicking this will give you a pop-up window and ask you to select a table or a range. Now notice that I clicked only in one single cell, and here the reference is made to all the cells which has data in it. Excel will also ask, where do I want to place my pivot table? This time I want it on a new worksheet. You could put it on an existing one as well. I will add it on a new worksheet. Okay. That's the first step. Now my pivot table is created, although nothing is in it yet. Now, let me zoom in a bit. Notice that this is the part which is blank here. So this is the space where my pivot table is added. And if I click outside of my pivot table, something disappeared from the right hand side. If I click in, I will again see these options. Now, what happens here is that the pivot table will pick up the column labels from my data set. If you notice, these are the labels, these are the strings, in fact, which are contained in the first row of my data set. If I click back, notice that here in the first row, there is a label for each column, okay? The pivot table picks up all the different labels, the different text, the different strings inside the cells here for each column, and then lists them here in the pivot table field list. This is called the field list. So if I scroll down, I see all the different labels which I can use as aggregation levels to arrange my data. Now, if for some reason this menu here disappears, it disappears if you click outside the pivot table, but if you're inside the pivot table and you don't see it, you need to click on Analyze, and here's the field list button, which can actually toggle this on and off. Okay. So let's add something to my pivot table. This field list is the labels in the field list is arranged right now as it appears in my data set. Now you can change this. If you click on the gear menu here, you can change how this is sorted. As you can see, sort in data source order. Actually, you can click on sort A to Z, which is more useful in some cases because it's now in alphabetical order. So you can find different labels more easily. Okay, I will pick the objective and add it to the row field here. Now, pivot table, the setup of a pivot table works in a drag and drop manner. So you can just easily drag labels here and put it to the right place. So I will drag objective and drop it into the rows box here in the bottom. Easy as that. Now I added the objectives to my row labels, and what happens is that the pivot table will list all the different labels here which is available in my dataset. This is basically the objective column. So if I want to demonstrate this, I go back to the raw data and see where my objectives are. It's here. This is the column. This is the row. This is the column label that I used, objective. And obviously, there are various types of objectives in this column. And obviously, many of them appear more than once. The pivot table will list each individual type of objective once. That is what is happening right now. So we see all the different objectives in alphabetical order. Let's add some values. I will find cost USD, cost US dollar, which is the budget for a given objective. So I will drag cost USD and drop it into the values box. Now, the first thing that happens is not probably what you expected, because you expected much higher numbers. Now, if you see here, it says count of cost US dollar. The pivot tables can do all sorts of different calculations for us. By default, for this data type, it is counting. That means that it will count every entry linked to these objectives. So if I click here, access to territory improved, I see that 63 different entries are available in my data set with this objective. Okay. Now, obviously, most often than not, you will want to sum up values instead of counting. Though this is also useful, but if you're working on a budget table, most often you will want the sum amounts. Okay. So to do this, you need to change the calculation setting, the value field setting. So for that, you need to click inside the value column. So not the objective, but the value column. Doesn't matter where. Right click and click on the value field settings. This will bring up a pop-up window in which you can change the calculation settings for cost USD. You can see it's now set to count. All I need to do is click on sum and then hit OK. And now I see totally different figures, because now the pivot table is adding all the different USD values for each of the different objectives. So if I see that here 700 something for access to territory, that means that the total amount of budgetary, the total amount of each row for this objective equals to 779, etc., number. So that's the sum calculation. Since these figures represent budgets, you would expect them to have a currency formatting. Again, we're going to right click inside the value column here, click on value field settings again. But we're not going to change the calculation, but click on number format. And here is actually where you can change the formatting. So I will select currency. The dollar symbol is fine. I will reduce the decimal places to 0 and then hit OK. OK once more. And now my formatting looks fine. Okay, so let's add some more details to this table. I will find the budget category and then this time drag it into the columns box. If I shrink my table a bit, now you can see that I have a different level of breakdown. I have my objectives here, and I have 4 different columns giving me 4 different levels of aggregation for each objective. These are the columns, and these are the rows. Notice that whatever you put in the columns box will provide some more levels of details into the columns. And whatever you drag into the rows box will set the levels of aggregation into the row section of your pivot table. So we've seen what kind of data is required for adding a pivot table. We've seen how to add pivot tables and set the source range and set the location. And we've seen how to add row labels, column labels, and how to change the calculation settings for values, and also how to adjust formatting. In the next video, we will look at how to sort and how to filter values inside your pivot table. Again, the source data for this exercise is available in the link below, and also the results of the steps we've talked about is also available in a separate link, so you can work with the raw data, try to follow me, and compare whether you arrive to the same results or not. See you in the next video, and thanks for watching.